Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all of the roses falling. 'Tis you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. 'Tis I'll be here in the sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Danny boy, oh, Danny boy, we love you so. And when ye come and all of the flowers are dying, and I am dead as dead I well may be, you'll come and find the place where I am lying, and kneel and say an Ave there for me, and I shall hear the soft your tread above me, and on my grave will warmer, sweeter be, and ye shall bend and tell me that you love me, and I shall sleep in peace until you come to
Got a nice crowd.
Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Nancy Cudahy, and I am co-chair of this program today. Yes, turnout. Joan, oh my goodness. Charlie lived for gathering up his neighbors, and he loved nothing more than to call us on the phone and say, "There's going to be a meeting on Saturday, and I hope very much you'll come." Yes, be there. And those old-fashioned words like, and while this event was inspired by his 100th birthday today, it's really about a celebration of this community we call Red Rock and all the wonderful volunteers who make it work every day. And I'm talking about the fire company, our brave neighbors who risk their lives every day to protect our own. And those members of the Historical Society, past and present, who have worked hard to preserve the memory of this place and its people, as well as to try to be good stewards to this beautiful building that we're in. This is a great day. When we first started planning it, we spoke to our colleagues at the fire company, and before we knew it, they were offering to cook dinner. Yes. And so you're all invited to stay for a delicious meal after the program is finished, starting at 6 o'clock. So I want to thank the Briggs family for their enthusiasm and support and traveling so far to come and share with us your memories of Charlie. I want to thank all the past and present members of the fire company and the Historical Society and any newcomers to our community. When we all moved to Red Rock, it was a place that not everybody knew where it was. And now, thanks to Google Maps, everybody knows where it is, but not everybody knows how special it is. And I feel incredibly lucky to have moved here 25 years ago. Not only did I meet my husband here, but I've had the sheer joy of raising my daughter in this beautiful place. And I've also had the privilege of serving on the Historical Society in various capacities, board members, committee chair, and I do that with great love and companionship from my neighbors who have served for all these years as well. So I want to thank the people who are responsible for today. But I especially want to acknowledge my co-chairwoman, Janet Cazzo. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for Janet. Last winter, Janet came to my house for a meeting and had a proposal. And her proposal was, let's celebrate the 100th birthday of Charlie Briggs. And typical of Janet, it wasn't just an idea that she threw out, but a fully developed program, which she laid out on our dining room table. And it was the archives that you see here today. It was the color scheme. It was the food ideas. And she has worked so hard with her husband Hiroshi to design and install this beautiful exhibit. So I want to thank her for her exceptional work. Our president is going to take us through the formal parts of the program. Jim.
First of all, I want to thank Nancy for co-chairing this event. She's done a tremendous job of getting everything together with Janet, and it's been wonderful to have co-chairs for an event, which gives the president quite a nice vacation. I've really enjoyed that. And I want to welcome you all. And because we are holding the special event today to celebrate the contributions of Charlie, we want to start the meeting the way Charlie always started it, with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if everyone would please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We are here today to remember Charles Briggs Jr., who was a resident of Red Rock for all of his 84 years. To some of us, Charlie was a relative, as in a father, an uncle, a grandfather, even a great-grandfather. To others, he was a neighbor, a friend, a mentor, or a confidant. He was a historical reference point for all of us who wanted to know Red Rock's past in its glory days. He grew up here, went to school here, worked here, and raised a family here with Helen, whom he called Honey. His contributions to the community were numerous. He was a model citizen who taught us what it meant to be an American. Charlie was also the official greeter. He made sure that all residents, either part-time or full-time, felt welcome and a part of the community. As Nancy said, many of us here today became friends when Charlie brought us together under this roof. In the next hour, we will touch on many of the memories that we have of Charlie. But right now, I'd like to introduce his immediate family. Joan Anderson, right here, his daughter, and he'll talk later, we'll get to you, and her husband, Brian, Charlie's granddaughter, Jenny, where Jenny's over there, and his great-granddaughter, Lily Jane. Her brother Owen is here someplace, or her father Heath is here someplace, Jenny's husband. And then Jenny has a twin brother, Jim, and his wife, Jennifer. They have a brand new baby girl, so they were unable to attend today. They have two children, Emmerich and Pruitt, two little girls. So welcome, and there are other family members here, cousins, nephews, nieces, and we welcome you all. I also want to point out before I forget that there are gift bags on the back bench, free for anybody to take. They have note cards, posters, other little things inside that you're welcome to take. The new Columbia County Heritage Guide is in there as well. Our program today is going to start with a description of the work done over the years to preserve the building that Charlie loves so much. Hugh Howard will take us on that journey. Linda Langer, who is the wife of author Steve Langer, will then share some of the pages of the wonderful book that Steve put together. And I, for one, am very, very grateful that Steve took the time to preserve Charlie's memories of Red Rock. David Cutterback will give us a reading of some little notes that Charlie wrote, and David will tell you more about those later. As you can see on the back wall, we have the pages of the 75th birthday book that was presented to Charlie by the community on his 75th birthday 25 years ago. And they're all on display, and Susan Stratton was responsible for putting that book together and came up with the idea. She's going to read us some selections from the pages. We will hear from Joan and her family, and the fire company will be speaking, giving us a little background. And then we'd like to have the audience share any memories that they would like to about Charlie and their life with Charlie here. At the end, our other co-chair, Janet Cazzo, has a few things to say. So we're all going to get started, and we will start with Hugh.
Judy?
Nope.
It's really great to look out at a room full of people. It's not always that way up in Madison. So welcome, all of you. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you are too. And I hope you are delighted with the color that we have on the walls here. It's been said that it's rather like being inside an egg yolk of milking powder. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I think it's a great set of colors. When this organization was founded in the early 1970s, it was a brainstorm of Charles. He was a waste not, want not Yankee. This was a perfectly good building. There was no reason to let it go to the dog, so he decided it should be conserved. And he went about doing that. The place had significance to him as a house of worship. But I think, in addition to that, I think it had a sense of community about it and also a sense of history, all of which, at some level, I think are preserved here. As the bylaws say, and I quote, to maintain and preserve the society's building in the form of Red Rock Methodist Church is one of the organization's principal goals. I remember George Lee describing Charlie in his memorial service as a natural aristocrat. which is actually a phrase I think George borrowed from George Washington. But it sure fits. And I think it's a wonderful thing that Charlie did to save this church and to get us all organized in the way that he has. But my task in the next few minutes is to talk about the preservation process that ensued after Charlie's death. Good things were done in his time, but buildings of this vintage require more or less constant attention. And this building was at the stage that it needed lots of significant things, some of which we've gotten underway in the last X number of years. It's been a group effort. I'm not going to name all the names of the folks who've been involved as members of the society, but what I am going to do is talk about craftspeople whose fingerprints are very much on this building. And let me just walk you through the process very briefly. We started by persuading a restoration architect from Albany by the name of John Mesick, who's a partner in the firm of Mesick, Cohen, Wilson, Baker, and a man named Don Carpentier, who's the proprietor of something called Eastfield Village. And they're two of the most knowledgeable people about historic structures in New York State to come and look at the building. They came, they looked, and they lauded, you might say. They described it as an architectural gem and one of the best preserved early churches in New York State. Nancy Cudahy, from whom we heard at first, was chair of the Restoration Project Committee that got underway. And now this is actually sort of funny. When we put together an initial brochure to raise some money, which I pulled out of a file the other day, or actually Janet pulled out of a file in London, and I read it. And one of the things it says is that we aim to carry out the restoration work over the next 2 years. That was in 1999. But I'm not making light because I mean, you understand, a baker's dozen years later. The building that, if not finished, is close to finished, and I think is stable and lovely and elegant and a testament to the people who've been involved. I'm going to name some names, as I told you I would. Mark Mendel and his crew at Monterey Masonry rebuilt much of the foundation. In the process, Dave Cooper here helped to fix some of the sills. At the next stage, Ed Russell came along and did the rest of the sills with full-fledged oak timber. Steve Anderson has been our go-to carpenter. He's around here somewhere. And he's done all sorts of stuff. We start on the roof with the shingles, and when we come down, we talk about the handicapped entrance and the windows at the back, and miscellaneous fixes and all kinds of things here and there. The windows and the doors were milled by Red Rock's own bespoke joinery, like Young, proprietor. Much of the plaster restoration, and there was a lot of plaster restoration to be done, as some of you may know. There were cracks kind of everywhere after we did the still work because there was jacking and so forth. Plaster restoration was done by Scott Culver and Mike Beecher. Ken Young painted the exterior. Sheriff Electric moved the electrical entrance, buried it out front. So now when you look at the building, it looks like a 19th century building and doesn't have that great swag of electric line right to the front of the building to start with. The Columbia County Highway Department even made a contribution when they came and took down a tree out front before Mother Nature took it down and dropped it on the building, which seemed to be promising to do. So, applause please for great work. Now, I need to talk about the interior painting briefly. What you see around you is the product of modern preservation science. Again, architect John Mesick came down, along with assistant Jerry Grant from the Shaker Museum, and took some scrapings, which he took back to his office, John did, in Albany, handed it to Christina Muir, who did both a microscopic analysis and a chemical analysis of the paint samples. And what she found was a wonderful surprise, namely the colors you see, in particular the ochre that's on the wall. Most probably, and this is an assemblage of some evidence and some guesswork, but most probably the sequence of painting in this building was when it was finished, after its initial period of construction, 1829, 1830 or thereabouts, probably the walls were whitewashed. Probably the wood was left unpainted. At some point after that, and at some point later in the century, or in the 20th century, other coats of paint were applied. But You know, one of the rules in the preservation business is where possible, save good original work. And the best original work that we had in this building were the pews. The pews are grain painted, faux oak finish, and probably they were painted at about 1850 at the time that this podium here was installed during a Greek revival renovation that was done at about that time. And almost certainly this compatible color on the walls was painted. So we decided to restore it to its circa 1850 appearance, which is what you see today. Now, this ochre color is variously called, if you ask Sherman Williams, goldenrod. If you ask Benjamin Moore, it's called cornhusk. In the 19th century, it was called Mars yellow. It was a very popular color. Thomas Jefferson used it in his dining room. He referred to it as chrome yellow because he managed to get his hands on a supply of lead chromate yellow pigment in his dining room. Needless to say, we didn't use a lead-based paint. The color was very fashionable, and even if you think it's kind of bright, you have to think about it in 19th century terms, and that is to say that if it were dark outside and we were in here with artificial illumination, there would be candles and maybe a few lamps. And even if you had a lot of candles and a lot of lamps, you probably have no more than 5 watts of light. Now, a typical light bulb is 75 watts. If we have a room like this, we got 10 and we got 7, so it would be hundreds and hundreds of times brighter than light bulb. And they would have known under much lower light conditions, this color doesn't seem bright at all. It reads as opposed to not reading because they have much less colored light. So that was one of the reasons that they had, and one of the reasons that it has a kind of very charming color. Now, deciding to take that route here to reapply the yellow paint, I think was somewhat a courageous decision. The right thing, historically speaking. But I want to thank Darren Spotwick and Natalie Deming for having the courage to make the case for it. So, in closing, a quick list of donors. We got $27,500 from New York State, State Historic Preservation Grant in 2000. John Shore in life, and after his death, his Quailwood Foundation and the Berkshire Taconic have continued to give us grants from time to time for specific purposes. The Lead and Folsey Foundation is giving us very generous funds. And of course, the continuing contributions that we get from various members of the community and the Historical Society are very welcome indeed. We still need help. Anyway, if it looks done, that's not quite true. The lights are wrong. There's lots of other things to be done. And of course, with an historic building, you always got to do the repainting. You always have to pay attention to maintenance. So we appreciate your ongoing generosity. Thank you. Finally, I just want to remind everyone that we are caretakers for this building. We've tried to be true to the spirit of those who built it and to those who've used it. Keep in mind that we've now welcomed 8 generations of Red Rockers to this building, a fair number of whom came here before this place was called Red Rock. This was originally called the South Canyon Methodist Church, and the town wasn't even known as Red Rock when this place was built. So, you see, buildings actually live longer than people do. Now, I know that Charlie enhanced the life expectancy of this building, and I would like to think that in honoring his memory and his mission, we are doing the same. Thank you.
Linda?
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming today. My husband, Steve Langer, put together the remembrances book, which you'll see on the table in the corner over a period of, was it 12 years? And in doing so, he used some tape recordings that I think Joan had made on your dad's 72nd birthday. In that vicinity. I think there were three tapes she could put together. So Steve had that as a resource. And then Charlie gave a lecture a few years later, I think in 1987, for the Historical Society, and that was incorporated into the book. And then Steve had a number of chats with Charlie to fill in the gaps. And finally, after over a decade, remembrances emerged. And do take a look through it if you have not seen it before. Among other things, it takes a tour of Red Rock, house by house, and I think that's really great fun, particularly for people whose houses are featured in the book. So do take a look. This is a little bit different. These are Charlie's reflections on farming and farms and farmers and neighbors in Red Rock in the 20th century. Practically every house through here was a small working farm in those days. Farms in the area ran in size from small ones of 5 or 6 acres up to pretty large ones. Ours up on Macedonia was at one time 179 acres. The Lamoureux property on Red Rock Road was also over 100 acres. The larger farms might have 2 teams of horses. Most farms had only 1 team of horses, and the smaller one-horse farms had only 1 horse, which they used to plow the garden and to drive to Chatham. Although you could get some supplies in the little store in Red Rock, you had to go to Chatham to do most of your shopping. Some of the people who had a horse or a cow or 2 that didn't have enough land to grow hay on would go around to the larger farms, and people would give them hay if they would cut it and cart it off themselves. That's how some people managed to get enough hay to take care of their animals. Sometimes people who had one-horse farms would work together. My dad used to do that once in a while. When he was down with 1 horse, he would sometimes help someone who had another horse. They would get the horses together with a double hay rigging, and they would work together, cutting the hay together. My dad worked helping out at many larger farms a few days a month, doing things like fixing fences after the winter and helping them get ready for the coming spring season. One of the farms he worked on was the Wesley Parks farm. They were great friends and they exchanged work. He also worked at the Lamoureux place and also at the Boudoir place up near our house in Macedonia. He used to walk to work there. When he went down to the parks, he'd drive a horse and buggy, and they had a place for him to put the horse and to feed and water it. The farms couldn't really be too big. They were all farmed with horses in those days. You couldn't cover much ground with a team of horses and one 14 or 16-inch plow. It took quite a while to plow a 5 or 6 acre piece of ground. You had to walk behind the horses and harrow, and they also had walking cultivators, single ones at that time. Then they did come out with riding cultivators that straddled the road and cultivated both sides. But with the old walking ones, you just went up one side and down the other. You had to make 2 trips just to cultivate 1 row. Everybody got along fine. There wasn't any money, and there wasn't any tax, and the cellars were full. There were bins full of apples and potatoes and carrots and things like that kept in the cellar, and they would last. I've gone down to the cellar in our place in the summer around the 4th of July and brought up a nice apple. And the cellar up there was beautiful to keep things in, with not a drop of water in it. And that's the way a lot of them were. A lot of the things that were grown were canned. There wasn't electricity, and there wasn't refrigeration in those days. Electricity came to Red Rock in 1926 or 1927. John Mickle owned the electric company in Chatham at that time. In order to get hooked up, everybody had to dig the holes and furnish the poles on their property. That was just on the main highway then. Electricity was not available on the side roads until much later. I got electricity up on Macedonia in 1947. I had farm units enough to get Roosevelt's rural electrification program, and at that time, you paid a flat fee. Down in Red Rock, it was $1 a month. But up on Macedonia, it was $2 a month, whether you used it or not. I gave them a right-of-way to go to the end of my property, and a few years after that, we started to get electricity all over the hill. It doesn't seem possible that they could have made a living in some of these places, but they did. They worked hard and made a living, and they had time to visit, and they were friendly. But the best part of it all is that they were so honest. I just think about that so much. Thank you.
Diane and I missed the 75th by a whisper. We closed 2 weeks after the party, so I'm especially pleased and honored to participate in the 100. I would like to introduce you to a Charlie Briggs that I only met 2 weeks ago. And that's Charlie Briggs, diarist and poet. Many of us knew Charlie or met Charlie for the first time because he looked after our houses in the winter. Us city slickers probably weren't bright enough to drain the pipes and things like that. I don't know how many houses he saved for us. But all of us were not beneficiaries the way the Langers were of small notes that Charlie would leave behind when he would visit and check the property. Linda and Steve were kind enough to share these with us, and I'd like to read just a couple of notes. And I will say, I'll bet you will second me on this. I don't know the glasses are going to be in trouble. I try to make a living as a writer. If I worked my whole life at this, I would hope maybe to write with the clarity, simplicity, and authenticity I hope you'll hear. Charlie was remarkably aware of the world beyond Red Rock, and he also responded to it with great compassion. On January 17th, 1991, the day after the U.S.-led coalition invaded Kuwait, this is the note Charlie left for Steve and Linda. War, war, war. It is a very sad day. 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later, on the 1st of March, Charlie wrote, "What a beautiful morning. The shooting has stopped over on the desert. What a wonderful blessing." In February 1992, California was ravaged by some of the worst floods in over 50 years. On February 14th, 1992, Charlie wrote, "A beautiful Valentine's Day, all white and very pretty. But my heart is with all those folks out in California. A terrible disaster I cannot get out of my mind. Please pray for them." Here's Charlie going about his rounds, a keen observer, conscientious, meticulous, to a point that sometimes I find charming. The last day of January 1991. It is a four-wheel drive morning. All the trees are covered with ice. The sun is shining, and it is beautiful, like a lot of sparkling diamonds. March 15th, 1991. I was the first one up on the hill this morning. We have about 5 inches of heavy snow, what the old syrup makers called the sap snow. Everything is all white. Bushes, trees, roofs, walk, the road, a winter wonderland. Now here's Charlie and his attention to detail. On the 19th of March, 1992, I forgot to give you 2 muffins on Sunday evening. I put them in the freezer. I took them out this morning. I think they'll be okay. March 20th, 1992. You get Charlie's subtle sense of humor and get a sense of what he thought of his neighbors. March 20th, 1992, the first day of spring, he wrote. The temperature was way up this morning to 8 above 0.
I'm Susan Stratton. I lived next to Charlie and Helen for about 17 years. I bought my house in 1980, but I don't know, John, if I ever told you this. I started hearing about your dad and your mom and George and everybody 10 years before that. Josh Friedman, who lived in what I still call Mary's old house, which is now the Denny's house, is a wonderful writer and was a family friend. He was so good, in fact, he went on to win a Pulitzer Prize and all this stuff. But when I lived in London, I would get these letters, you know, little onion skin things, you know, before computers and all that. There were actually handwritten letters. And there were wonderful tales. It was kind of like out of a storybook about a place that Josh called Happy Valley. So it was describing everyone here, all the neighbors, how close they were, a young George Lee who was following in the footsteps of Charlie and whatnot. And it was an odd thing. About 10 years later, my husband and I ran into Josh, and he said, you know, I think there's a house available in Happy Valley. And he said, no, really. So we went the next day, and the car pulled up to the real estate office, and I said, that's Charlie, and that's George. That's Helen, because I knew them already. So one of the things I was privileged to be as Charlie's neighbor was a listener. As David was saying, he was a really eloquent individual. And when our neighbor Mabel Mercer died, Whitney Bailey was kind of a big wheel of the New Yorker magazine, where they have Updike and Hemingway and all those guys. He ran Charlie's quotes in 4 full columns, just like Hemingway and Updike or whatever, in tribute to Mabel Mercer. So it was a natural thing, you know, among the really thousands of hours I logged talking to him, and was privileged to listen to the tales about his growing up and his family and whatnot. When it came to be 75, I thought, well, this is easy. You know, George and I talked, you know, we'll just have a birthday party. It's great. We'll have a cake and a card, and it'll be fine. Well, Charlie didn't want any of it. You know, he didn't want to celebrate getting older. So George, in his diplomatic way, said, well, maybe it's a way to bring together people like Susan, who are weekenders, with people who live here all the time. Well, so certainly, as soon as it was part of our community, Charlie was in. So I thought, okay, I'll get a card. I folded a big piece of manila paper together, and George and I made a list, and I started off to get people to sign, you know, happy birthday from the Strattons or whoever. And I started with the Doyles. And I called them ahead of time, so I went up to see Jack Doyle. And at the table in their kitchen, Jack, Ethel, Dave, Joe, Nancy, Maureen, Tom, Pat, and Joanne sat down. And I was kind of surprised because I just expected them to do this, just sign their name. And in fact, they spent 2 hours and 20 minutes talking about Charlie. And I said, well, I've got something very different on my hands. So I said, well, could you do a card maybe from your family? And so they did. And this is it's beautiful, you know, hand typed. And I'd just like to read it to you. You can see the little picture of the coyote and the raccoon and some more dead coyotes down. And so this is from Jack and everybody at the Doyle's Brothers Farm. We remember Charlie Briggs when he hayed his fields in Macedonia, raised potatoes in Macedonia, gave us ice cream cones after a swim in the sheep hole, got married to Helen Ashley, built his new house in downtown Red Rock, went to Prospect Lake on school picnics, brought groceries to our house, hunted pheasants in our swamps with Champ, Art, Harold, and Joe, shot his buck deer in Den Woods on the first day, was elected treasurer of the Red Rock Fire Company, was appointed East Chatham postmaster, cut firewood with Fowler on the ridge, tracked raccoons in the house and barns, stopped to visit with Fowler en route to town, got his first coyote, was elected president of Fire Company and Historical Society, was always there to help at times of need, such as death, fire, or life crisis.
God bless Charlie Briggs for what he has done for all of us. So this was the first card I got. I thought, well, we better try to follow this up. So using George's list, I went around and met people who I really didn't know, but who were friends of Charlie, and I was welcomed. And so what you see here was really individual birthday cards from different families. In my family, we wrote, Jack Doe is a hard person to follow, but this is what we wrote. A next door neighbor gives you a lollipop if your mommy and daddy say it's okay, teaching you not only to ask your parents' permission before doing something slightly forbidden, but also teaching you the bigger lessons that there are safe places outside your home where wonderful things can be had. A next door neighbor gives you a free ride in the back of his pickup truck. He's a master of treats. A next door neighbor watches your house when you're away. He watches out for you when you're home alone. A next door neighbor silently assures you that he will protect your loved ones from harm. He also helps you fix the lawnmower, jump a battery, set mouse traps, and cut wood. He gets your driveway plowed, calls the plumber and fuel man, guides you to somebody who'll get the job done. He's a master of vigilance. And in your steady knowing way, as you hunt, trap, plant, gather wood, tap the maple, share wisdom, you, Charlie, are most importantly a master of example. Even my folks in Chicago, my dad said something, and here's us over a quarter of a century ago. So I was one bookend to Charlie, and there's somebody else who lived on the other side. And this was after I got all these, this was the last one, came just on the day of the celebration. And talking about good writers, listen to this one. April 1st. 1953 was still winter in Red Rock. There was an inch of snow on the ground, and a thin layer of ice coated the rocks on the banks of the Indian Creek. It was opening day of the trout season, but the fish were still dormant from winter and inaccessible to even the most skilled fishermen. I was 6 years old and had finished all day without a bite. Trout are leery and shrewd, and it seemed impossible to catch one. I spent hours fishing the summer before under ideal circumstances with no luck. At about 3 in the afternoon, I was discouraged and cold. I was fishing behind Charlie's house in a pool where the roots of a dead tree extended into and over the water, providing shelter for fish. I baited the hook and threw the line into the water. I leaned the pole against the tree and walked across the street to the store where Charlie was sitting alone in his old chair beside the kerosene pot burner. After a brief exchange on uncooperative nature of trout, I sat on Charlie's lap, and he read to me a story from Field and Stream magazine about a skin diver who had a narrow escape from a ferocious barracuda in some exotic tropical lagoon. When the story was over, I walked back to check my pole, and to my shock and amazement, there was a tug on the line, and within seconds I was racing across the street to the store with a 7-inch trout in my hand. I trapped it, Charlie, I yelped with ecstasy. The event was recorded. I still have the picture, my first trout, caught in the Indian Brook behind Charlie's house on a freezing day in early spring, when I sat on Charlie's lap in the store that is now my office. Over the years, I've heard Charlie tell the story many times, and when he tells it, I remember just the way I felt. On your 75th birthday, on behalf of the community, I want to thank you for reminding us of the small but truly important things that are so easy to forget. It's signed Possum, but we also know Possum is George Lee. There's just one other thing I want to share with you. You should really take a look at these. Paul Burson, who was a really close friend of Charlie, but was too shy to write anything, signed his name, he writ large. He was so proud of it, being able to contribute in some way. Some things you'll see the kids' drawings, kids that are already engaged now or married with families of their own. But Elizabeth Belsheim did a really sweet page, and there's a little birthday card, and I didn't notice this until today. She had a reading from Psalm 1, verse 3. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water. That kind of sums it up. And then this is not hers, but I thought I would just close with this. It says, "Happy birthday, Charlie," and has a verse, again, typed. Remember typos? Right? "Let me live in a house by the side of the road where the race of men go by. The men who are good and the men who are bad, as good and as bad as I. I would not sit in the scorner's seat or hurl the cynic's ban. Let me live in a house by the side of the road and be a friend to man. Let me see from my house by the side of the road, by the side of the highway of life, the men who press with ardor of hope, true men who are faint with strife. But I turn not away from their smiles nor tears, part of an infinite plan. Let me live in a house by the side of the road and be a friend to man.
I'm going to just put a few pictures of my son's family here because he wanted so much to be able to be here. And he has a 1-month-old and a 2-year-old and a wife who needs his attention. So he's doing the right thing. We are two girls, Jim and Jennifer. Jennifer is a twin, Jim is a twin, and they had 2 single children. Very grateful for. First, thank you for doing this. I don't know how else to say it except thank you. And I got my notes here because I probably need it. This is a wonderful community. I really miss it in so many ways, but my life is elsewhere, and I think I'm following a little bit of my parents' example in the lives we live in Northeast Ohio. And so we are so glad to have a piece of that legacy in our lives. But first, I want to say that you have here one treasure of a woman in Jenny Nightingale. So,
And Steve. Chopped livers. Thank you, John.
I've been thinking of legacy, as we all do when we get to these ages. What you leave, what you keep, what goes on after you, those are ways to describe legacy, I think. I think part of legacy is the memories of experiences we've had, of things we've been given, of things we have given, of places we've been, with people we love. And then the other piece is the intangibles that remain with us as part of who we are. They become part of our DNA, which we can give to others after us, and they can continue to give. As you can tell, as you've heard, I have a wonderful DNA. I really do. And I am so grateful for that. But I do not have my father's memory. He probably could have said some of those dates just off the cuff. Well, he did that in Ohio, and Brian may mention some of those, but he would just say, well, this day in 1987 was... So I will relate a story or two, and Brian will have some as well, and hopefully some of the rest of you will be thinking. He was not a particularly hands-on father with me. I'm a daughter, and it was a little difficult for him to know quite what to do with a daughter, but he taught me many, many, many things by example, by just being the man he was and letting me see that and giving me pieces of it from time to time. I'm very grateful for that. I do have some memories, and one of them is having caught a 17-inch brown trout in the pond just by the Red Rock. Might have been a 19, or maybe it was a 21. It was one of those. it was just fun. I also also have memories of baseball games in the summer, up on the hill, in the field on the hill, and that's the way it's called, up on the hill. Lots of us, I think Marge probably remembers some of those baseball games. Yeah. And the comment every Christmas as we went through the woods, got some kind of tree, scruffy, sort of tilted, uneven, that this was just about the prettiest Christmas tree. Every year. Every year. He gave nicknames to everyone. You've already heard about Possum. I was Piety. Jim was Jimbob. Jenny was Jenilyn. And many of you may have nicknames. Darlene was Little Bean. And she called him Uncle Bean. In fact, that was on his funeral flowers, Uncle Bean. Some of us have carried that tradition on, but not quite so successfully. I often remember him sitting in his red recliner, reading his Bible in the evenings. I remember him in the garden, working very hard in the garden, making the rows very straight. And when I started gardening, he had to bite his tongue to say, hey, your rows aren't straight. Which, of course, I wasn't going to do because his were I remember times when he would yell at me and he would yell at him, they would fuss at each other. Everybody remembers some of that. And then some of the particular words that he had, like Schoppenschmittenschmeister. Does anybody remember that word?
What's that?
Schoppenschmittenschmeister? Say that. And then he would say, that's just pixelated. And we thought that was a nonsense word until technology introduced us to pixels. You've already heard what a visionary he was. He's absolutely a visionary. But he was a visionary who was quiet about it, which is a nice balance. It really is. I think he really had dreams for benefiting his family and his community, and he just worked quietly to accomplish those dreams. And I think he succeeded, don't you? He did. He certainly left us much richer for having been here with us. An important piece for me of the intangibles which I took with me was an idea that I use with a lot of parents who I might be counseling. And that is that very important things to leave your children are roots and wings. They were wonderful at the roots part. I had such a strong sense of roots. They weren't so good at the wings part. But it was a very new time. I was part of that generation that left home. I was one of the first in my family to leave home. I have a cousin on my mother's side who was 1 year older, and he left 1 year before. And I know that that was extremely painful for them, and most of you know that as well. But they did not try to shrink my wings. They did not. They could have, many times, they could have said things that I would hear because I was sensitive to their concerns, but they did not. That's a wonderful legacy. Wonderful legacy, and I'm so grateful. And I, most of the time, try to pass that along to our children. I'm so grateful that although I left, so many of you have been here, had been here, and remain family for both my parents. such a precious name. Community, fire department, paramedics, things like that. My mother could push her button, and people she knew would come to the house to help her get up after she fell. So I'm just so grateful for this community and for this family in this place. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, I've probably been in your house. I come up here, we come up here at Christmas time, and Charlie would be checking houses. And he always loved company for anything he was doing. And it seemed like I was the one he'd drag along. And so if you had Charlie check your house, I've probably been in it. And some of you really have fantastic houses. It's been a while. But it was always a great experience. And of course, Charlie, as people indicated, I mean, he just respected whatever you had in your house like you wouldn't believe. And he would look at everything coming into the house, inside the house. And if anything looked slightly amiss or something, he would let you know, or he'd contact the right people. He was just the most conscientious person that perhaps I've ever known. But Charlie was a great guy. He was a lot of fun. He loved his family. He loved the neighborhood. He loved everything around him. He didn't like meanness. He never understood why people liked football. He liked baseball. One time he went down to New York City and saw the Yankees play. I don't know if you know, and Lou Gehrig was playing, and a couple of guys got in a fight, and he said Lou Gehrig came over, and he was bigger than everybody else, and he just grabbed a hold of the two guys and more or less picked them off the ground and looked at them both and set them down, and they just turned around and walked away. And that's what he remembered most about that ball game. But anyway, I don't know, there's so many stories I could tell about Charlie. I wrote here just a few words, and I'm not going to tell, a few titles of possible stories. I'm going to tell all these. One is 60 miles an hour, ladder in the woods, wind direction, gypsy moths, hippodome, coasting through Red Rock, electric light company, and coonskins in the cellar. Let's start with 60 miles an hour. One of the first times I met him, he came up to pick me up at the airport at Albany. This was just a little bit before we were married. Joan and I were married here in this church in July of 1969. And part of the history of this is Charlie painted the inside, he painted the ceiling of this church by himself for that wedding. He managed to get scaffolding up and did it. At any rate, he came up to the airport and picked me up. And he hadn't gone that much up to places like Albany, even by 1960. I think this was early 69, a little before we were married. And so we're coming back, and the speed limit is 65, and everybody's going 70. This is before the oil embargo, before the speed limit was ever reduced to 55 and then back up again and anything. So the speed limit was 65. Most people are going 70, and he was mostly going about 55. And all the cars are zooming by, and of course, I'm 24, 25 years old. I've driven across the country and back and everything, and I didn't say anything, but I think he could tell that I was a little bothered by the speed, and that all these cars were zooming past us and everything. And as we're riding along, he just said, I think 60 miles an hour is about as fast as a person should ever go. And that's just where he was then. Now, in truth, as time went along, he learned to do what everybody else was doing. And I think Jenny can remember that there were times we would meet in the middle of Pennsylvania. Charles and Helen would drive out there, and they would pick up Jen and Jim from us so that we could go on a vacation somewhere. We went to Europe a couple of times and things like that. And they would come out and get them. And I was still thinking, well, Charlie's this really conservative driver. Jenny told me one time, he was going over 70 miles an hour. He managed to get with it in the end. Wind direction. Charlie was a farmer. I mean, we heard some of his history. That's why he started off on a one-horse farm, really up on the hill here, and it never got out of him. And the weather just was always so much to him. He was always aware of the weather, and Joan talks about his memory. He could tell you about every storm that ever was in his life, past probably about the age of 6 or 7, exactly what day of the week it was and how bad it was. I mean, I can remember that a few years ago there was a bad storm here or there, and I have trouble remembering which month it is and after a while which year. Charlie never had that problem. He could just tell you about a storm in detail that was 15 years ago, exactly what time of year it was and what he was doing that day and everything. And one of the things I noted about him was he always knew the wind direction. You could stop him in the middle of the house where he couldn't see outside and ask him which way the wind was blowing. And he would know, not that he had some sixth sense, but because he'd been walking around, and when he went by a window or he went outside, he would always know which way the wind was blowing. And if you would say something like, well, it seems to be getting colder, usually his response would be something like, yeah, the wind shifted around, moved into the northwest about 10 o'clock this morning, and it's moving even farther to the north now. It's not going to warm up soon. I mean, that's the way farmers had to operate, I think, back then. You kept track of the wind. As long as it came nicely out of the west, you had fair weather. Started moving around, you knew a storm was coming. It started coming out of the north, you were in for cold weather. And he just knew that all the time. Just was something, you learned early on you needed to know. Gypsy moths. You remember the gypsy moth infestation? Oh, I hated those things. I mean, they were eating all the leaves and everything. He would walk around, Joan can remember this, with a can of oil, a coffee can about half full of oil. And he'd just walk around in the trees picking off gypsy moths and throwing them in the can to kill them. And he would do that by the hour. And you look up the hillside, and the hillside's full of these things. I mean, he isn't making a dent in the gypsy moth. I couldn't stand these things eating up the trees. I mean, the infestation was halfway to Ohio, across Pennsylvania. That he didn't care. He was doing his part. You'd sit there talking to you about whatever, just plucking off gypsy moths, put them in that can. Hippodome. People remember the Hippodome? Anybody know what I'm talking about? There used to be a geodesic dome that people lived in up on Macedonia, up over the top. And I remember when it was first built, and we drove up that way, we were driving past there, and I mentioned to him, that's a geodesic dome. And he said, well, I met the young people who live there, and he said they seem like very nice people, but, he said they're what we would call hippies, And he got to thinking about it, and he said, so I'm going to just call it the Hippodome. So ever after, it was always called the Hippodome. Red Rock. Anybody ever ride with Charlie coming back down the road through Red Rock? In his pickup truck, you get up to about the schoolhouse, he'd shut everything off. You've coasted all the way. A lot of people would talk about how tight Charlie was. It wasn't necessarily that he didn't have the money, but he hated to see it go. And whenever you come down, you knew what was going to happen. Out of the schoolhouse, everything went off, and you just coasted all the way to the driveway. Here's in each room. You bring this wood in, put it in the wood boiler, and it would generate the steam, and it would go up through the radiators. So he got all of that off his own property. The water you had in the house came from a well that was up on the hill across the street. next to us now, the real estate office. It was halfway up the hill there, and it was just gravity feed. Came down, went under the road, you went